call to order the meeting, and the first item will be Carol Gomez annual report on the AB 2766 meeting.
Okay.
Good morning. Okay, so as stated, I'm going to give an overview of our fiscal year 17-18 2766 activities. The purpose of the report is to show how the funds were spent and the outcome of the results, I should say, of the funds, the amount of emissions reduced. For background, or actually, excuse me, the purpose of the report, we do need to send this up to CARB. It includes what I said, the fees and the results. Actually, I think I went ahead. Sorry. I got ahead of myself. Okay, let me get back on track. Okay, background. 2766 was adopted in 1990. It provides revenues that we received from the Department of Motor Vehicles. $4 of the DMV registration fees goes to the 2766 program, of which the first 40% is savined out to the local governments on a quarterly basis. There's 162 local governments who receive these funds, and they're to spend the funds on 11 different mobile emission type project categories. My next several slides have some photos of the popular categories. This one, transportation demand management, which is basically a rideshare type program. One example.
Is it possible to get a number to put to the last slide?
Oh, sure. The one on the background, that was slide number 3.
No. I meant a dollar number to the amount of money that we get from the DMV registration surcharge.
Sure. Yes, that'll be in some upcoming slides, but it's about $22 million, just short of that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so on the rideshare programs, many of the local governments use their funds for these type of programs, but just one, for example, the city of Santa Ana has 60 employees who rideshare who receive different types of transit subsidies. Alternate fuel vehicle purchases and infrastructure, that's another common type program. An example here is Pico Rivera. They purchased 4 new EV charging stations for their city hall. These are interesting pictures. This is in Fontana, and the picture on the left shows an intersection prior to the spending of 2766 funds. The one on the right shows after they put in sidewalks and they put in railroad crossing safety guards. So this makes walking more, it encourages walking, and then it also makes it safer.
Can you tell me what that does for air quality improvement?
There are, for the emission reductions, and there'll be some slides on this too, there are a couple different categories that even though projects are allowed, they don't really have emission reductions that you can quantify with them. So the whole land use category is one of those, but you'll also see that not a lot of the funding goes towards land use.
Who makes that policy?
The city council members for each individual city. The policy in general, though, was originally by CARB.
Then why are we involved with this money if we have no control over how it's used?
By legislation, it was set up this way that the monies would come to our air district, and that we were the ones that would be that have the authority to subpoena it out to the local governments. So it's in legislation.
And if I might,
So then we need to change that legislation, because I don't think this agency ought to be in the business of improving walkways for railroad crossings. We're in the air business.
Dr. Burke?
That's my personal opinion. Now, I've been saying this for 20 years, so it's not like it's going to jump out of the back and run down the street, but I'm definitely going to talk to Mr. Nastri and Mr. Alatorre about it. I'm tired, this is not what, they can have the money. I'm not arguing with them about the money, but don't send it to this agency. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of my time this morning to have to listen to this.
Dr. Burke?
Yes. I know. It's your city, get some of that money, right?
No, I'm just, as the chair of the MSRC, who really administers this money, determines the work program to use it, I raised the same questions when I joined the MSRC about
Right.
what are the criteria pollutant reductions that we've been achieving, and sometime they weren't able to come up with numbers. So you will notice in our current work program that we've got going, a 3-year work program, we are concentrating almost all of our effort in support of the AQMD goals. And we are working with the ports, with AQMD, with the inland ports, with putting money into near zero and zero emission vehicles and things like that. So I think we're making improvements in this area, and I think us supporting the goals of the AQMP is a good thing for the MSRC to do with this money.
I think you're absolutely right, Larry. I think you're absolutely right. Okay, let's continue to go forward, and I'll try and control my intention.
Trying to make it better, but I agree with you. We shouldn't be spending.
Okay.
We shouldn't be spending any of this money if it's not reducing criteria pollution.
Okay, going on to slide 7, PM10 reductions. For the most part in this category, it's spent on street sweepers or street sweeper programs, and the Coachella Valley spends a good portion of their funds on PM reduction programs. Bicycles, that's another category. The city of Long Beach has quite a few bicycle programs, but one in particular I think is interesting. They have 150 employees who use city-owned bicycles to go to their local meetings versus using city vehicles. For this program, as I mentioned, the money comes to us from the DMV. We subpoena it out quarterly to the local governments. They then spend it on appropriate projects. They submit an annual report. We put those all together for the report that you have today. And then it goes to your board for approval to send on to CARB, and there is an audit function with this program. In overall summary, there's 162 local governments who participate. They receive just under 22 million, of which 19 million was spent for this fiscal year. And that resulted in 358 projects, of which 235 had quantifiable emission reductions, and it resulted in 98 tons of emission reductions. As far as history for the last 5 years goes, the beginning balance, that reflects funds that had not previously been spent. The MV fees received, that's the monies from the Department of Motor Vehicles. The amount spent, that 19 million, shows they spent more this fiscal year than last fiscal year. The ending balance, and then the pre-designated is the monies that they have plans to go towards specific projects. They're just saving up enough to spend on whatever projects it is that they're looking at. And so for this fiscal year, 85% of the remaining funds were pre-designated, which shows that they do have, the local governments do have plans for these projects. This slide is similar, except for it's broken down by county. So you can see by county how much was received and spent. LA, because it's the amount of funds received is based on population, receives the highest percentage of monies. As far as expenditures by the different categories, the top 3, all fuels, transportation demand management, traffic management, of the 19 million spent, 69% was in those top 3 categories. This slide and the next slide show emission reductions and cost effectiveness. If you look at the transportation demand management one, the top one, while it was the second highest in terms of funding, it is the highest in terms of emission reductions. 57% of the emission reductions are coming from this one category. The other thing I want to point out also, just using that line, you can see it has 57 projects quantified and the cost effectiveness is $33.51. But that 33 reflects an average of those 57 projects. So within each of these lines, there's a variation on project cost effectiveness. This is a continuation, so overall there's the 98 tons that were reduced. And another comment I just want to add about cost effectiveness is that for some of these, especially when you're looking at vehicle purchases, in this fiscal year in particular, there were a high number of vehicles that were purchased towards the end of the fiscal year. So because of that, they didn't have opportunity to put on very many miles, so that also drives the cost effectiveness numbers up. This is kind of more just a visual of where the emission reductions are coming from. Of the 98 tons reduced, 75 tons were from those top three categories. Continuing with emission reductions, this shows a breakdown by pollutant and by county. And the far right column shows the total that each county's projects were able to reduce. On a historical chart on the cost effectiveness, you'll see that the cost effectiveness has been increasing, but that's a trend that we expect because of vehicle standards improving and fleet turnover over the years. A number of the local governments provide some, if not all, of their monies that they receive to their local COG, and then the COGs use them for regional type programs. I already mentioned CBAG uses it for an extensive street sweeping program. And then Western Riverside COG and Gateway COG have other programs that they use the monies for. For outreach, we work with the local governments. We receive calls and emails daily from local government staff asking us questions about various type categories and projects, and so we respond to those. We every year hold training classes. We're currently preparing to do 17 training classes in January, in which we go over the software reporting tool, but we also go through all the categories and go into detail on those, on what is and is not an approvable type project. We recently signed an MOU with CARB, so that CARB owned the software program, and so we've taken over the rights to manage that. So since we've done that, it's an Access-based software program, so we've already updated it to the latest version of Access. Before it was a very old version, and then we have some other plans on updating the software. In addition, we're currently working on updating the resource guide. It hasn't been updated since 2013, so we're going to be working on making it a better document, adding more examples of things that can and cannot be done. And then finally, we'll be taking this report to your board in November, asking for your approval and for us to be allowed to submit it to CARB. And with that, I'll answer any other questions.
One of the things that got me amped up on this was that a couple of years ago, the representative to our board from Orange County was complaining to me about a small city in Orange County that had used some of these funds for a Christmas party, which, you know, he found outrageous, and quite frankly, I found outrageous. So when he approached them about the use of the funds for a Christmas party, they said, oh no, we have an AQMD booth over there in the corner, and that's how we justify the use of their money in this, so, you know, is that kind of thing still going on?
Well, I'd like to think no, but I will say anytime we do have an audit function with this. I just briefly mentioned it because that's actually done by our finance department. But they do go out and they audit the funds and how they were spent. And if any of the funds were found to be not correct, then they take action on those. Either the local governments can pay the funds back, or they can.
Have you ever had an example of action taken on the misuse of the funds?
Yes.
Ever?
Well, there's been many.
Many?
Yeah, there's been many over the years. There is a person from finance that's here that could probably answer that more fully, but I do know that there's been many.
Okay. Can I speak to them?
Yeah.
Actually, I brought some stats with me.
This is John Campa from our finance department.
Good
morning.
Hi, John.
How's it
How you
going?
doing?
All right. Well, I did bring some stats from the previous audit that you probably find interesting. We basically have our finance, we go out to audit every 2 years on this program. So the last audit consists of fiscal years 15-16 and 16-17. And so we saw we actually, review all 162 agencies that see this, receive these funds. 23 agencies actually had findings. There were 43 audit findings. 19 audit findings were non-monetary, meaning they were just type of findings for financial reporting non-compliance. 12 were actually for unallowed expenditures. 8 were for not maintaining supporting documentation. 2 were for not basically allocating interest earnings to the program. So if they have cash balance, they're required to make that interest earning go into that special fund. And then we had.
Can you tell me what the 4 items of non-appropriate use of the money were?
Well, for unallowed expenditures, anywhere from using it for, like, kind of an example that you gave, using the funds for like having a party for their city, those types of things.
So what is the penalty for doing that?
Well, basically, the agency has 2 remedies for that. One, they can themselves repay the funds, show documentation to the auditors that they've replaced those funds into the special revenue fund, or they can have us withhold those funds from future disbursements, revenue disbursements to them. So basically, they have to pay back the funds one way or the other.
If criminal law was like that, what you would do, you could go rob a bank, and if they catch you have to give the bank back their money,
Yeah.
or you tell the bank, if I make some more money, you can keep the money from that. That's basically the penalty, right? Is that the only penalties allowed under the statute?
Yes.
Then I want whoever's responsible for putting something together, I want them to meet with Wayne and Derek and myself, and we're going to put forth a penalty position in that legislation that has some teeth in it. Okay?
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Well.
Are there any other questions?
Let me ask you. Yeah, I have one more question. I know you want me to shut up, but I got one more question. The motion on this item means that we what are we approving?
Receipt of the report and the information that we received from all the local governments. And to pass it on to CARB.
Well, first it goes to the full board for approval, and then it will go to the CARB, but it does require full board approval before it goes to CARB.
Okay, well, Is there a motion for approval?
I move that we approve it for sending to the board.
I'll
Is there a
second.
Okay. Would the clerk call the roll?
Supervisor Bartlett,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem McKellen,
Yes.
Mayor Mitchell,
Yes.
Supervisor Rutherford,
Yes.
and Dr. Burke.
No.
Motion passes 4-2.
It's,
1?
no.
No.
I'm a no, okay? I want something when this goes to the board, that people know that we recognize that there's something rotten in Denmark. So I am voting no. And it can go to the board with a majority decision.
I don't disagree with you, Dr. Burke, and I think cities who misuse these funds need to have some penalty applied.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chair Burke,
Raquel? Yes.
Chair Burke, this is
Yes.
Supervisor Bartlett. You know, I'm going to change my vote and agree with you on this.
I didn't mean to cause a snowball effect here. Thank you, Supervisor. Item number 2.
Good morning, Dr. Burke, board members. My name is Zorik Kurvasian, Planning and Rules Manager with Planning Division. I will provide a brief update on the status of our facility-based mobile source measures for commercial airports. As you recall, in the 2016 Air Quality Management Plan, AQMD had proposed 5 what we call facility-based mobile source measures covering airports, marine ports, rail yards, warehouses, and new and redevelopments. Those measures were intended to provide additional reductions from mobile sources toward attainment of our ozone standards in 2023 and 2031. Following the adoption of the AQMP in 2017, there were a number of working group meetings that we held with various stakeholders on covering all 5 sectors, and staff made recommendations back to the board in May of last year, and we received directions from the board on each of these sectors. So for the commercial airports that I'm going to cover in this presentation, the board gave us direction to pursue a voluntary memorandum of understanding based on their implementation of their air quality plans, which would cover non-aircraft emission sources. I will not cover the other sectors in this presentation. So the MOUs will be basically with the 5 commercial airports, LAX, John Wayne, Ontario, Burbank, and Long Beach airports. And from the outset, all 5 commercial airports committed to develop their individual air quality plans, air quality action plans. They call them air quality improvement plans. And they also committed to work with us on the MOU, developing the draft MOUs. And development of these draft MOUs, we want to emphasize that has been through a public process. We've held 4 working group meetings with the stakeholders, representatives from airports, airlines, various airport tenants, environmental organizations, and agencies over the last year and a half. We provide updates to the Mobile Source Committee, also updates to the governing board on all 5 sectors, including commercial airports. We also had a public consultation meeting last week, and also want to emphasize that each of the airports has had its own public process to essentially consider approval of their draft plan and the draft MOUs. And of course, each MOU will be subject to approval of our own governing board. The objective of the MOU is obviously to achieve emission reductions, and we want to be able to quantify these reductions and to get SIP credits, which means quantify those reductions and claim those reductions toward their attainment demonstration for the ozone standards in 2023 and 2031. So in terms of the process, each airport has already developed their air quality improvement plan or measures, which includes specific measures from non-aircraft sources. And we have collaboratively developed these draft MOUs working with each of the 5 commercial airports, which specify those measures that we deemed to be eligible for SIP credits. And we would work with EPA to essentially get SIP credits for those measures. And in the event that, I guess we don't expect it, we have full expectations that full emission reductions from these measures will be achieved. But in the event that there is a shortfall, we also would be developing substitute measures to submit to EPA. So in terms of roles and responsibilities in the MOUs, the airports are agreeing to implement the specific measures that they have developed, working with their tenants, and they also agree to provide annual reports to AQMD on specific equipment and vehicle data and on implementation of the measures and quantifying the emission benefits. And in turn, we are quantifying the corresponding SIP credits, providing enforceable commitments in terms of committing to those actual emission reductions and reporting to EPA, establishing metrics to track progress, and also having a process to cover any potential shortfall, and of course providing public access to all the information and documentation. The plans that the airports have developed, as I mentioned, cover the non-aircraft emission sources, covering categories such as ground support equipment, these are equipment that service the aircraft, heavy-duty vehicles, delivery trucks, as an example, off-road equipment, and passenger and employee transportation. The measures vary among airports and reflect the uniqueness, obviously, of each airport. Almost all 5 commercial airports have common measures for ground support equipment, the fleet that they operate themselves, and also for infrastructure improvement. And they also establish performance targets for these measures, and they also vary among airports, which again reflect the mix and type of the fleet that they operate. And they also quantify the emission benefits for these measures to the extent that they are quantifiable. And I want to reiterate that the MOUs that we develop with the airports only include those measures that we deem are eligible for SIP credits. The plans that the airports have developed include a lot more measures, and we want to acknowledge that. And again, airports have gone through a significant process to develop these plans and come up with these measures, and we want to acknowledge that effort. But because some of these measures are either not quantifiable or not easily quantifiable or not SIP creditable, they're not included in the MOUs. In order to get SIP credits, we need to meet EPA's requirements in terms of demonstrating that the emission reductions meet their integrity elements, which means that reductions have to be quantifiable, permanent, surplus, and enforceable, which we have demonstrated in our staff report, and it has to have that enforceability commitment from us that we would achieve those reductions and address any potential shortfall, providing technical support in terms of how we quantify the SIP credits. Funding, again, refers to incentive projects that at least one airport is offering, that they're already providing the funding already for that one measure, so there's not an issue there. And legal authority, obviously, to enter into MOUs and administer these incentive programs. And of course, providing mechanisms for public disclosure and tracking. In our staff report, we provided documentation that we meet all these requirements. In terms of the specific measures that are in the MOUs, I'll just go through them very quickly. For the LAX MOU, we have 3 measures. For ground support equipment, there's an fleet average emission factor that becomes stringent, progressively more stringent, and essentially would require equipment to be cleaner, either zero emission equipment or cleanest available equipment. LAX also has an incentive program which allocates $500,000 in funding to assist in accelerating the purchase of near zero and zero emission equipment. And finally, they also have a program to replace up to 100% of their buses with zero emission buses by 2031. The John Wayne MOU also has 3 measures covering ground support equipment, again, establishing a NOx emission factor, which becomes more stringent over time, a measure to install a jet fuel pipeline to eliminate fuel delivery trucks, and also a proposal to replace 80% of the shuttle buses with zero emission buses. And Burbank, Long Beach, and Ontario have similar measures for ground support equipment. They've established, again, fleet average emission factors for their ground support equipment. There are different emission rates because, again, they reflect the mix of fleet that they're currently operating. And Burbank also has a zero emission bus program requiring 100% of the buses to be electric by 2031. Just a quick summary of the SIP credits for each of the measures. In the next 2 slides, I won't go through each of them individually, but as you notice in the next two slides, a majority of the reductions actually is coming from LAX, from the ground support equipment measure, but all the other airports also providing emission reductions, and obviously every little bit counts toward our attainment demonstration. In aggregate, we're estimating that we will be achieving about half a ton a day in 2023 from the airport's MOUs, and about 0.4 tons per day in 2031. The number may not seem that significant, but when you look at the inventory of ground support equipment, this is actually about half of the emissions in 2023 and about 70% of emission reductions in 2031 from that individual category. In terms of our enforceable commitments, we are committing to achieve these reductions based on the implementation of the measures that airports are agreeing to implement, tracking the implementation of these measures based on the annual reports that airports provide, and we also report to EPA on implementation of these measures and the actual reductions that are being achieved, and providing these reports publicly accessible so that the emission reductions can be independently verified. And we're also going to adopt and submit substitute measures in the event that there would be any emission shortfall. Again, as I said, the expectation is that we will not only achieve these targets and hopefully will even exceed them, but in the event of any potential shortfall, we would submit substitute measures to EPA. In terms of our next steps, the airports are already in the process of going through their own public process and presenting these draft plans and MOUs and seeking approval from their respective airport authorities next month. And we will come back to the Mobile Source Committee next month to provide further update on this development, on the MOU developments. And currently, board is expected to consider approval of this measure, which includes the draft MOUs as well as our enforceable commitments in the December meeting. And we also continue to evaluate the development at San Bernardino Airport, which is again a significant increase in their cargo operations, and we can report back next month. But from our understanding, for the ground support equipment, they're proposing to use all electric ground support equipment already, except for maybe a couple of categories that for which electric may not be available. So they're already kind of exceeding the measures that we already have for these 5 commercial airports. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions by my colleagues, Ms. Rutherford, Supervisor Rutherford?
I'm still a little confused about how the CARB regulations on the zero emission airport shuttles and the upcoming regulations on the zero emission airport ground support are going to affect these measures and SIP credit.
Yes, so for the...
Well, I get the answer might be we don't know.
No, we know actually. For ARB's airport shuttle regulation, the requirement is that 33% of the shuttle buses have to be electric by 2027, and I think 100% by 2035. So we took that into consideration in figuring out the SIP credits. So they don't have any requirements in 2023, but they do have it for 2031. So for 2023, we can take full credits for whatever the measures are, whatever the airports are implementing, but for 2031, we had to discount it to account for the ARB's regulation. As far as the upcoming regulation for ground support equipment, CARB is in the process of developing that right now. They expect to go to their board next year, so there's really no proposal in place. But once they adopt it, obviously there could be adjustments to the SIP rates going forward.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Chair Burke?
Supervisor Bartlett?
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that voluntary MOUs are certainly the right approach to working with the various airports. And I know that I want to thank AQMD staff for really being collaborative in this process. John Wayne Airport is a kind of a unique airport, and the collaborative MOU approach has allowed my team at the county to work alongside AQMD to support all of our efforts here. And in the very near future, the John Wayne Airport MOU will come before the Orange County Board of Supervisors, and I look forward to supporting the item and the resulting emission reductions. Thank you.
You know, Orange County is very fortunate in having the cooperation of John Wayne Airport. And when I fly out of John Wayne, it is really a very different experience than flying out of LAX. So,
For a whole host of reasons.
so I have a couple of questions. If everybody else is through, I don't want to get in front of anybody. Does anybody else have any questions? Hearing that, I'll go ahead. If you took LAX as in quantitative size, how do the other 5 airports compare to LAX? Are they all combined half as big as LAX or twice as big? I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, yeah. One way to look at it is in terms of the number of passengers that they have. So LAX has about 88 million passengers. This is as of 2018. John Wayne is about 11 million. Long Beach is about 4 million. Ontario and Burbank are about 5 million. So LAX 88 million. The others, again, John Wayne about 11, and Long Beach, Ontario, and Burbank about 4 or 5 million. Yeah.
Was there an answer in there?
Yeah, so LAX is about 88 million total, and the other 4 combined are about 25 million total.
So it's probably between 3 and 4 times.
Yeah, about 3/4.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't want to bore everybody, but the reason I actually served on AQMD was because of LAX. When I came to Los Angeles way back when there were dinosaurs on Wilshire Boulevard, there were guys who at the airport who got your luggage, and they were called sky caps. And they were black guys. And the ones at United Airlines were mostly from Cleveland, where I'm from. And so I knew 4 or 5 of those guys, you know? And so in those days, flying was a different kind of experience. You know, you got dressed up to go on an airplane, and they served real food and all that stuff. So going to the airport was an experience, right? So every once in a while, I would go to the airport and not be going anywhere. I'd just go out and see some of my friends who were sky caps at United Airlines. And one by one, my friends started disappearing. Now, I had a particular friend, his name was Skyler, and this guy looked like a movie star. I swear to God, he should have been a movie star. So one day I went out there looking for Skyler, and Skyler was gone. So I asked one of the guys, I said, "Where's Skyler?" He says, "Oh man, Skyler died." I said, "Well, what do you mean? He was like 40 years old." And he said, "Oh, you know," he says, "all these guys die out here." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, you know, the stuff that these fumes and the stuff that comes out of the air, they're killing us." Now, at that time, I was about 27 years old. And I didn't know what the South Coast Air Quality Management District was, or even if there was one then. But it stuck in my mind. And when the opportunity came up a number of years later to serve on this board, I jumped on it. I jumped on it because I knew that even if the greater mission of South Coast is all 4 counties, but I knew that at that airport, it was a really vital mission. So over the years, I have now become a volunteer Uber driver for my wife and my daughter, okay? So my main mission is to pick them up and drop them off at the airport. Now, LAX Deborah Flint, I love Deborah Flint. Don't get me wrong about this. She has done wonderful things out there. But when it comes to air quality, they're a little slow. Now, they're trying, and she calls me, and their people call, but they're slow. Now, if you really wanted to help air quality there, you wouldn't be talking about tow motors and electrical equipment. You'd be talking about getting those cars out of that turnaround that has, of those 88 million people that go through there, I bet you 80 million of them drive single cars. So, you know, I applaud the effort of trying to get the equipment and all those things electrified but when you're down to talking about the minuscule numbers that you're talking about reducing pollution, I think that we ought to take those people who are misusing the funds we were talking about before and make them stand in the middle of that turnaround in LAX for a day or two. And that would be a punishment for them. So I would like to encourage you to talk to them. I know there's a people mover coming. We need to find out at LAX how much that people mover will actually reduce the number of cars going through there. We need to figure out a way that we can help them reduce those cars. Because if you're talking about pollution from the airport, I'll bet you those 80 million cars coming through there a year are dwarf the airplane emissions. Just my guess, you know. So that's my, we have some testimony about this. Is there any testimony in CCA?
The public comment? None here, Dr. Burke.
Okay, well, Ms. Mendoza is here, and we have Mr. La Cruz here at Lux. So why don't you come up here and sit down and talk to us?
Good to see you, Dr. Burke.
How you doing?
Good, how are you? Good morning. Oh, this is not a good angle for me.
It's not a good angle for any of
Let
this.
me take my glasses.
Okay.
Move things a little bit. I won't see myself. Good morning, and first of all, I wanted to say thank you to the staff for their hard work in getting the MOUs to this point. Your former board member, Joe Liu, and I, we were part of the group of people that negotiated a community benefits agreement with LAX back in 2003, 2004, and we know how difficult it is to work with the airlines and the airports, particularly because of the jurisdictional issues. They're obviously subject to jurisdiction of the FAA. And as they told us, they're not in the business of improving health, they're in the business of moving goods and people. So I want to applaud you for your hard work in getting to this point. Two quick points I wanted to make. One is, I see in your report to the board today and also in the meeting that we had earlier this week that you plan on doing written reports to the board annually, that you'll get annual reports from the airports on their progress. I would like to respectfully suggest that you also make verbal reports to the board, which will allow the public to ask questions and express any concerns they may have about compliance with the MOUs. There's no third-party compliance element in the MOUs, and so we'll be relying on AQMD and the airports to be fulfilling their obligation. And if you come to the board and you're doing your report verbally, that will allow for public comment and for questions and concerns to be raised at that time. So I'd like to respectfully request that. And then the second point I wanted to make is, as noted in your presentation, all of the airports are going to be making changes with respect to the ground support equipment. However, one of the things that came up at our meeting is that the airports are not willing to commit to complete scrappage of old polluting ground service equipment. They are willing to retire that equipment, but they're not willing to commit to scrapping it, to destroying it, and making sure it doesn't go to another airport and pollute other people, perhaps even outside the region. I think this is an issue that goes to the integrity issue as it relates to the SIP. When you say that the air pollution improvements are going to be permanent, if you're going to make it permanent, then you have to destroy the equipment that's causing the air pollution. I just think that's a logical, it's a logical permanent measure to make sure that that polluting equipment is completely taken out of the commercial realm. So that would be my respectful suggestion. I know it's late in the game and you want to get this to the board next month, but I just wanted to put forward those thoughts. I want to thank you for your time today and again, applaud you for the hard work that you've done to get to this point with all 5 airports. Thank you. Oh, and I didn't mention I'm from the Coalition for Clean Air.
You know, she has an excellent point there. Because if you're just going to retire it and move it to another airport, you know, that really doesn't do what you want to do. So I would like to see this at the board next month myself. But if it in fact takes longer to work out something like that, I don't think that I shouldn't speak for all the members of the committee, but I would think that we would be willing to delay it to accomplish that.
Dr. Burke, so we're planning on coming to the board in December rather than November. We want to come back to this committee in November, but time is short because the airports are considering their plans and the MOUs now. So we'll re-examine that scrapping element.
Yeah. Dr. Fine, you know, one of the things that she said that really kind of disturbed me was, you know, everybody is in the business for themselves. And I know that airports are in the business of moving goods and people. But when you say you're not in the health business, that, I don't know who said that or how, in what text it was said. But when we're negotiating these MOUs, what is our stick?
Well, Dr. Burke, as we presented to the board last year and committed to, if these MOUs did not work out, we were going to revisit the idea of indirect source rules. So the stick was, this was one approach, but if
Is there any other? Because about 5 people just jumped under their desk when you said indirect source rules. Is there any other way is there any other stick that we have?
Once the MOUs are signed, then we can, those are contractual agreements that we can enforce. But no, the way that this went forward was we were going to give this a shot, see how much we can get and present it to the board. And if it was not enough or it didn't work out, then the idea was look at regulations. So that was our stick.
What regulations are available to us?
Primarily our authority under the indirect source, our indirect source authority.
Okay. I think I've caused enough consternation for this morning. I better keep this thing moving. Mr. De La Cruz is here to testify.
Dr. Burke,
Okay. Here, he said he'll cause some more.
Dr. Burke, if I may respond to the second point that Ms. Mendoza brought up in terms of what happens to the replaced equipment. What airlines have basically told us is that it's extremely expensive for them to move equipment. So what happens is that they use them until they're extremely old, and they either scrap them or use them for spare parts. So and there might be rare occasions that they move them to another airport within the basin, and we've already got an agreement from the airports and airlines that they would report that to us in the event that that happens. Again, it would be a rare occasion that you would be moved to another airport within the basin. So they already agreed that they would let us know. So this is a new language that we've been discussing with the airports as of yesterday, actually. So we think that would cover and address the concerns that Ms. Mendoza had, actually.
Okay, because I know everybody's thinking, in the days when we were trying to get the scrapping of buses, they just drive the buses to Central or South America and use them there for another 20 or 30 years. And so we just moved the pollution out of the LA basin and put it in Guatemala or El Salvador. And that's coming back to bite us right now. I'm sorry for you to have to wait so long.
No, of course. So thank you, Chair Burke, and thank you for members of the committee for offering this opportunity to weigh in. I want to thank staff for providing several opportunities and for also being very engaged. My name is Carlo Dela Cruz, and I'm representing the Sierra Club today. We've been very involved in the MOU process, not only around the airports, but around the indirect source rule and facility-based measure. I want to speak today on 2 points, one regarding the ground support equipment, and really just the second point on if this MOU approach is going to be the most effective way that we can improve air quality across all of the different freight and the goods movement industry. But first, let me talk about GSE, ground support equipment. I fully second Geraldine Mendoza's comments about the need to ensure that the scrappage is verifiable and that it is publicly, that the information is publicly available so the public knows where this equipment is going. I think that's a big part about being able to demonstrate that these programs are working. Even though they're a voluntary basis, people want to understand how is this actually being effective, even if it's just a voluntary MOU. And I want to point to the language that's in the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Incentive Program. That language is very excellent in asking for documentation on the scrappage and replacement or retirement. I would respectfully request that same type of language to potentially be used for the ground support equipment. And secondly, I just want to add that I think we could be more ambitious with the fleet-wide averages. Rather than just putting a NOx average for the fleet, I think we should be targeting either 50% or 100% of turnover, because we already see other airports like SFO that are already setting the ambitious goal of 100% electrification of their ground support equipment by 2023. And I think that other airports, rather than just having a fleet-wide average, can really be more ambitious, especially as Zurich just said, we won't be able, the South Coast AQMD will not be able to claim credit for the turnover once CARB has its regulation. So I really believe it's to the benefit of this agency and to our air quality that we push the airports to do more in the onset. So that way we can take more credit in 2023 rather than waiting for the CARB regulation to really push these MOUs further. Lastly, I just want to zoom out and ask, is this MOU approach really getting all the reductions necessary to hit our our attainment goals and not receive federal penalties? It was said in the presentation earlier that we're expected to get 0.5 tons per day in NOx reductions in 2023. And to a lot of the communities that we're working with, that is simply not enough. And so if that is the best we can do from this process, I really want to encourage staff and the board to really think more bold when we consider the other sources of pollution that affect the basin, including rail yards, warehouses, and new development redevelopment. Knowing that my time is running short, let me just say that when Dr. Burke asked about what is the size of LAX compared to the other airports, Ontario right now is only 5 million, but they expect, and they in their own report said that they can include capacity for 10 million passengers and eventually 30 million passengers. So are these MOUs also allowing the emission reductions to exist in the future with respect to growth and expansion at these airports? Especially because we know these MOUs can't cover all sources, like the Moreno Valley Air Force Base, which is currently getting the extra capacity that Ontario cannot provide at this minute. Thank you for your time, and thank you for letting me go over.
Good point. Good point. What's the answer to his question?
I'll give it a shot. So in terms of the performance targets that the airports have offered, we have worked with them and we've again asked them to propose the most stringent performance targets that they can achieve by 2023 and 2031. And these are the best targets that they've been able to offer given the technical feasibility and commercial availability and cost. But this is something that, they consider to be the most cost effective for them or technically feasible for them. In terms of MOU reductions, the half a ton a day, how that works out in terms of the overall scheme of things. In the next presentation that Dr. Reese is going to talk about, we will see the overall picture of how that fits into how we're going to meet our attainment demonstration. But again, just a reminder that half a ton a day covers mainly ground support equipment and some shuttle buses and trucks. There are two other major categories that we're not addressing the MOUs. The aircraft is obviously under the federal government, but in the next presentation, you will hear that we're asking the federal government to do a lot more, come up with a lot more stringent emission standards for aircraft that would give us more reductions from the airports. And the other major category for the airports is the trucks, cargo trucks, delivery trucks, and that will be addressed in our indirect source rule for warehouses. So all the cargo facilities that are operating within the airports will be subject to that ISR. So there will be more reductions coming from airports. This is not it. This is just part of it that affects the equipment.
What about the growth issue?
Growth is already reflected. So whenever we did our calculations going forward,
I mean, in the MOU.
they're all reflected already. Right.
Question.
Yes, growth is already reflected.
So when you are negotiating this MOU, who's on the team?
On our team, yes.
Yes.
Yes, we have our legal staff, our technical staff.
Who on legal staff goes with you?
Megan?
And sometimes me.
And Barbara.
Okay. I feel more comfortable if they're involved, because the airports will try and roll over you. And it seems to me that they've done a pretty good job of that so far. Because it's kind of like the bank robbery thing again, that we have no teeth to get back at them. So, I think that you should be recommending to the board that we should be approaching the legislature on putting some teeth in. And since they want to be in the transportation of people and goods, we're in the health business, so we ought to have the tools to do our business. So if we don't have the tools to do it against those people, then the legislature ought to provide them for it. If they want us to have them. If they don't want us to have them, then I understand. But we need to ask for them, because the legislature. Listen, I had lunch with my kid Tuesday. I couldn't believe the number of people. We're at lunch. There must have been 25 people came by the table and asked her about all these various projects, from vaping to legislation on gambling. So legislators very rarely have the idea of what legislation is needed on their own. Somebody's got to bring it to them. So if we need help, we need to really get in there and get some teeth into some of these things.
So Dr. Burke, if I
That's much.
make a comment on that?
Yes.
So there's probably some things that the state legislature could do with respect to motor vehicles that are servicing the airports, but the primary preemption for the aircraft itself is a matter of federal law, so we would be happy.
Well, I
to
understand
comments.
that. And what I didn't say was the airport's in my daughter's district. So I know she's not going to want me to shut down the airport, okay? So I'm not crazy, but we need to ask them for help on some of this stuff, because they are a huge business, and they are getting bigger. But we need to have some kind of counterbalance in there. So anyway, on this item, do we need a motion?
No.
No motion required. Okay. Then we'll move on to item 3.
Good morning, Dr. Burke, members of the committee. My name is Sarah Reese. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in Planning here at the district, and I'm going to give you a briefing on our draft contingency measure plan for the upcoming 1997 8-hour ozone standard. So just a little background, everybody's aware that we have a deadline in 2023. We are an extreme non-attainment area in the South Coast Air Basin, and we have to submit for the end of 2023 our plan. In 2007 AQMP, that was our initial submission of the state implementation plan. Our 2016 AQMP provided a control strategy update that included both defined measures and then what we call these further deployments of cleaner technology measures. So these are what we call Section 182E5 under the Clean Air Act, the black box measures. And I'll talk a bit more about what those are in future slides. But when you use these contingency measures, 3 years before the implementation, the attainment date, you have to submit a contingency measure to show how you're going to cover the reductions associated with the black box. And so our draft contingency measure plan, we're preparing it now with our staff and then also doing that in conjunction with CARB. It's just some background to show how ozone trends have progressed over time. We've actually been successful in decreasing ozone concentrations in the basin since 1997. You can see a fairly significant decrease. You will note that there's a little bit of an uptick in the last few years, and we are in the middle of evaluating what some of the factors might be behind that uptick, but we do expect that ozone concentrations overall will continue to decrease in the basin. And then this is showing trends for emissions and then measured concentrations. Consistent with that decrease in ozone over the years, we've had a decrease in NOx and VOC emissions, and then measured NO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have also decreased. Looking at the progress over time since 1997, fairly significant emission reductions, which is great, but we still have a way to go. So in 2023, we expect our carrying capacity, which is the amount of NOx we can have in the atmosphere and still attain the standard, that is at 141 tons. You can see as we get down to sort of our projected scenario in 2023, we're at 269 tons, so we have to make up that gap. So remaining 11% of reductions since all the reductions we've taken since 1997. This is a chart that just shows that NOx reductions provide a most efficient path forward for ozone attainment. We've discussed this before. You can see on the different isoplex that show the different concentrations of ozone. VOC emission reductions also result in reductions of ozone concentration, but it's really more dependent upon NOx. And so having those NOx emission reductions is the path that we need to pursue. So in our 2016 AQMP, our overall control strategies, and again, the baseline NOx emissions in 2023 are 269 tons per day. We need to get down to our carrying capacity of 141 tons per day. And so we had a number of measures defined. So we have defined measures of 27 tons per day. We also have then this further deployment of cleaner technologies, which is 108 tons. And then there's also a set-aside budget in there, but that's what got us down to the carrying capacity number that we need to hit. And then breaking out what those further deployment measures look like, we did assign them to different categories. So you can see that ocean-going vessels is a big chunk of that. On-road heavy duty is a big chunk of that. Off-road equipment, and then we have some small for on-road locomotive and aircraft. So this Section 182E5 is a black box provision. It's only allowed for extreme non-attainment areas, and it's there because EPA or the Clean Air Act recognized that there would be future technologies that could be developed. So at the time that you're putting your plans together, you have quite a bit of time in which to attain when you're in extreme non-attainment, and recognizing the technology could advance over that time. And so there could be some newer engines, newer controls in place that would help you get the emission reductions required. But with that comes the catch that 3 years before the implementation plan or the attainment dates, you have to be able to show what your contingency measures are in order to be able to meet that deficit of what would be in that black box provision. So in our draft contingency measure plan, we have identified additional emission reduction strategies. We're also pointing to additional incentive funding that will help us turn over the fleet and get cleaner engines in place. But then we talk a lot about federal measures and federal responsibilities, because this is important, as there's a lot that the federal government could do, a lot of sources that we don't have direct authority over that contribute very significantly to the NOx emissions that we need to achieve. So this is just a breakdown of our identified emission reduction strategies in the contingency plan. You can see we have various measures that add up. The bottom line is we get to about a 24 to 26 ton per day, filling in that 108 tons in the black box. And then CARB has a piece of that with their innovative new measures, which is about with 3 tons per day. And they have a variety of additional measures that they're looking at that we can get those emission reductions, things like improve or more updated diesel engine standards, looking at a locomotive emission reduction measure, and then a variety of other measures that they have looking in place. In terms of additional incentive funding, in our 2016 Air Quality Management Plan, we estimated that we needed over $1 billion a year over a 14-year period to be able to provide incentives for turning over the fleet. Right now, we have expected future funding, approximately $800 million over a 4-year period. This is coming from a variety of categories of funds, ranging from we have AB 617 related incentives, Carl Moyer, Prop 1B. We have some funding from VW settlement, and then some other additional funds there. We know we need more funding, so part of that is our voting district authorization legislation, which we believe would bring $1.4 billion per year, and then looking at some other mechanisms. But overall, we would expect that in 2023, from this additional funding, we could achieve a 15 ton per day emission reduction in NOx. This chart just shows the emission trends for major sources and the major sources that the authorities who have primary control over those sources. And what's the key take home here is you can see that emissions in these major categories are light and medium duty vehicles and the heavy duty vehicles. They're going down over time. But when you see the line that's controlled by the federal government, the bottom red line, so the aircraft, ocean-going vessels, and trains, that line's actually pretty stable, maybe even trending a little bit up over time since 1997. So it again highlights the need for or shows that we've done a lot at the district level with CARB in terms of reducing emissions, but there's still a lot of work that needs to happen at the federal level. And when we look at the contribution of federal sources in 2023, it's about a third. And so these are ocean-going vessels are the top category, but then also trains, the aircraft, there's also a portion of federal on-road mobile sources that contribute as well. Notably, stationary sources are 15% of that contribution, so it's really looking at mobile sources, and of that, the federal sources are a big chunk. So potential federal measures that we are looking at that can help us get to the remaining portion of the 182E5 commitments, looking at some additional standards or low NOx heavy-duty vehicles, so getting those cleaner engines in place by 2023. We think that could get us up to 35 tons per day. On ocean-going vessels, the federal requirements to require the cleaner engines on the ocean-going vessels to visit our ports by 2023, requiring on locomotives that they be powered by Tier 4 engines, which are the cleanest engines, and then also on aircraft, looking at various mechanisms where they can get some reductions. So when we add it all up in terms of our contingency measure plan, we have 24 to 26 tons per day for the identified emission reductions for both us and with CARB. We're looking at a 15 ton per day for additional incentive funding, and then really looking to the federal measures of the federal government to provide a 67 to 69 ton per day emission reduction. That gets us to the 108 tons that we need for 182E5. So this was a summary slide. If you can take home a message from this, you really are doing all we can to reduce emissions with our current funding, with our current authority and the constraints that we have on that. But we really do need all levels of government, including the federal government, to work with us to take action to reduce emissions. We do need more incentive funding. We've been very successful with incentive funding over time in turning over the fleet, but we need more of that so that we can get to those cleaner technologies in place to meet the air quality standards. And, again, calling on the federal government to step up and do their share to address the emissions that we lack the authority to address. So in terms of where we are in the process, last week we released the draft contingency measure plan for public comment. We are here in front of Mobile Source Committee today, and then this afternoon we have a public workshop to talk about the draft contingency measure plan. We'll be back in front of Mobile Source Committee in November to talk about our final plan, and then we'll be going to the board for consideration of the plan and for submission to CARB and EPA in December. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions for Sarah?
Dr. Burke.
Mr. McCallum?
Thank you. The 15 tons per day additional that you're ascribing to additional incentive funding, is it really realistic to count any of if and when such a tax was passed for 1.4 billion? Would any of that be received in time to have any effect on 2023?
We only took, the assumption is that would take effect in 2022. So we only took 1 year credit for 1 year's worth of credit for that income. So that would be in time for 2023.
So what are you, 1 year is what, how much?
It's about 1.4 billion with some inflation at 0.5 cent. That's one way to raise that amount of money. Obviously, we're still looking at other mechanisms as well.
Well, my personal opinion, of course, is that that tax will not pass, but good luck.
Any, yes.
Chair Burke.
Supervisor Bartlett?
Thank you, Chair. So slide 13 demonstrates the expected funding that AQMD will receive, as well as the additional funding needed to provide the future incentives. I'm still very concerned about the voting district authorization legislation, and it's listed as the only source of additional funding. The other mechanisms right now are just listed as TBD. I know that several members of the board have also voiced concern about the legislation, including myself. And so unless there are updates that the board hasn't received, from my understanding, the future of the bill is still unclear at this point. So question that I have is, what other mechanisms is AQMD looking at? And I would request that we continue to focus more heavily on ways to reduce costs, enhance efficiency, investigate other mechanisms, and look towards partnerships rather than simply focusing on taxing the communities that we serve.
All right. By the way, I was in Sacramento, and my understanding is the bill is what do you call it when they table it, like
2-year bill?
Yeah, well, a 2-year bill, but it was sent to suspense. So I don't know if it comes out. They're talking about bringing it out and taking a shot at it in January, but that's to be determined. So the chairman of the legislative committee is on this call. So if she has any information, maybe she'll impart that to us.
Okay, and I also look.
I was just going to say, we understand just what Chairman Burke said, that the bill was pulled at our request. And so Senator Ben Allen pulled the bill and put it in suspense file. It became a 2-year bill. We expect it will arise again in January with the other 2-year bills. But I share the concern of my colleagues here as to whether that bill can pass. It's one thing to get the voter authorization district, that's step 1. Step 2 is to have the measure brought before the voters and get consent from the voters to tax themselves. So you're looking at a two-step process, and I agree it's problematic whether we'll be able to get there.
So I think it's really important to look at the other mechanisms through AQMD, and I look forward to hearing from staff as to what those other mechanisms might be. Thank you.
Supervisor Bartlett is echoing my comments of about a year ago, because you can't pin your hopes in one basket. It's a lot of money, and we need a lot of things done. We have some testimony here. Is there any
Dr.
testimony? Yes.
I wonder if we could hear from staff the answer to the question that Supervisor just posed.
That was Siri. You were talking to Siri. My phone answered
So we don't have legislative staff here today, but we continue to look at everything, especially on the federal side. You heard us talk about the federal responsibility and some potential actions they can take, regulatory actions they can take, which are still very aggressive. But if they are not willing to take those regulatory actions, it is still their responsibility, and then they should come up with the funding. So we're still very active in DC, trying to find sources of funding, fighting for the existing sources of funding, which are admittedly quite small, the DERA funding, targeted airshed grant funding, but we've been successful in keeping that funding and increasing it slightly. But what we really need is to increase that by an order of magnitude at the federal level, and we're making the case that these are sources that are not state responsibility. So the federal government should step up either through regulations or through funding. So yeah, that 15 tons a day is again what we think we could get if this measure passed. If it doesn't pass, if that legislation doesn't pass or a ballot measure doesn't pass, we need to find other sources of funding, either at the federal level or other local measures that we're looking at. And we continue to take an all of the above approach. We had our funding working group that had the long list of different things to look at. This was the one that seemed to have some legs, so that's the one we've been focusing on. But if it fails or doesn't move, we're going to have to look elsewhere.
Is there any possibility that the district could get 15 tons per day by regulating the stationary sources that we have control over?
Not in that time frame, and probably not ever. It's we just saw in the last presentation a half a ton a day, and it seems small, but in the stationary source world, a half a ton a day is enormous. We talk about reclaim, we talk about 1 ton a day and 2 ton a day, and that's pretty big in stationary source world. So to get another 15 out of stationary sources would be a pretty heavy lift. And we're already have proposed and are proposing new stationary source measures that you see in that defined commitment. So we're already getting additional reductions there. So going 15 tons a day further would be very difficult.
So just, if I could add to that, Mr. Chairman, the remaining emissions, NOx emissions from reclaim, after implementing the shave that the board adopted in 2015, are going to be smaller than that 15-ton total that we're looking for. So all the largest NOx sources together would not give us those 15 tons even if they were gone.
We're actually going to take that down to 9 tons a day by 2025, and we're proposing we can get 2 tons a day between the 14 and 9 early in 2023 based on the current work that we're doing.
And Mr. Chairman, I do want to mention that the federal government has not been a friend of California. And so to look for them for additional funding raises some serious questions.
Yes.
I want to mention one other thing. This is an accelerated schedule. We have a Clean Air Act statutory deadline at the end of December to submit this plan. And we started working on it this summer thinking, we'll shoot for December, but if we need more time for stakeholder input, it's not a disaster if it would go beyond December. But given recent battles between EPA and California, we don't want to give them a chance to come after us anymore. So we really are shooting to get something in by December. If some details need to be worked on beyond December, submitted to EPA later, that's okay. So it is an accelerated timeframe because of that.
Supervisor Bartlett?
Thank you. So speaking of the federal government and not necessarily helping us in some regards, so there was an update on the OCTA board yesterday from our federal lobbyist regarding the rulemaking on passenger vehicle emissions. So evidently on September the 27th of 2019, the EPA and the NHTSA jointly published a final rule entitled the Safe Vehicles Rule Part 1, One National Program. And the first part of the Safe Vehicles Rule, it actually revoked California's Clean Air Act preemption waiver, which is the legal authority underpinning California's more stringent tailpipe emission standards and zero emission vehicle targets. The first part of the Safe Vehicle Rule did not explicitly invalidate California's air quality model, resulting in significant uncertainty surrounding the project level consequences of the final rule. This could still be invalidated in the next part of the Safe Vehicles Rule. The timing of the release of the next part, though, is unknown at this point. There's a letter from the EPA administrator, Andrew Wheeler, to CARB. And in the letter, the EPA administrator discusses California's SIP processing backlog and requests an update by October the 10th as to what steps California is going to be taking to expedite the SIP processing. The issue is that a withdrawal or denial of the SIP would initiate a 2-year statutory clock on sanctions that could ultimately result in the loss of federal highway funds for California. And I was just wondering to what extent we're going to weigh in from the AQMD perspective.
The response to that letter has been already sent to EPA, and it pointed out the number of inaccuracies in the letter. But I think that we have a CARB board member here on this. Mayor Mitchell, do you have any inside information?
I will tell you what I know. The CARB was informed of the pullback of our waiver. The waiver affects greenhouse gas emissions, but of course affects criteria pollutants as well, since we work on those two things in tandem. We became aware of that at CARB on Thursday, September 23rd, I believe that was the date. On September 24th, CARB in 23 states filed suit against the federal government to enjoin the pullback of the waiver. And then this letter that you're talking about that Andrew Wheeler sent was sent to CARB on the following Monday. So you had a sequence of events with the pullback on the waiver on Thursday, CARB filing suit on Friday, and US EPA Andrew Wheeler coming back with the letter that we're out of compliance on Monday. I know our staff and CARB worked together to refute all the claims in the Andrew Wheeler letter, and Mary Nichols responded to that letter on October 9th. I asked our staff to send copies of that letter to the legislative committee. That was done, but perhaps members of this committee should get a copy of that letter as well. It is public. I don't know how easy it is to find it online, but we do have it within our.
Mayor, we posted it.
That would be great, because I was not aware of the letter.
We posted it to our.
Why don't we ask staff to send it to the letters of a copy of the letter to all the members of this, in fact, to the entire board.
Probably to the entire board.
Yeah, and make sure there's paper in your machine, because this is a long letter.
Dr. Burke, and this is Barbara here, just wanted to add that at the last board meeting, your board also authorized us to challenge both those actions in court. And so we've been coordinating with the CARB attorneys and the attorneys for the other states that are involved in that lawsuit.
Okay.
Dr. Burke, one more thing that I'm sure Supervisor Bartlett is concerned about as well is that some of the actions taken by US EPA affect the modeling that our metropolitan planning organizations use to plan transportation conformity between the transportation plans and the air quality plans. That model is called MFAC, and that model is now in question. And so this raises some serious questions for SCAG, and that includes Orange County and all the 6 counties down there in Southern California, as to how we will now approach regional transportation planning and achieve transportation conformity. As you know, if we don't have transportation conformity, there can be an immediate pullback on our ability to get transportation funding, and that is the big concern. That our plans, the transportation plans we have in place, won't be funded.
Any other questions, Supervisor? Bartlett?
No additional questions. Thank you.
Okay, is there any testimony in CCA?
Anybody? None here, Dr. Burke.
Okay, well, we have a couple people. I'm going to ask Ms. Mendoza to come back.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. Good morning. I just wanted to correct, and I apologize for this. One of your slides showed that 14% of the NOx in the South Coast Air Basin are subject to federal jurisdiction, and that's ocean-going vessels. I actually wanted to suggest that that's actually subject to international jurisdiction. Ocean-going vessels are only subject to state jurisdiction within 20 to 25 nautical miles from the coast. So it's actually an international jurisdictional issue, not a federal issue. And the reason I raise that is because ARB is promulgating a rule right now to regulate ocean-going vessels when they are in dock. And it's called the at-berth regulation that will go into effect in 4 phases, starting in 2021, in which case in 2021, they are going to require container, reefer, and cruise vessel auxiliary engines that currently run on diesel to either plug in to alternative power or to control and eliminate their emissions while they're in dock. So the reason I raise that is because it's going to go before the California Air Resources Board for their approval and consideration. And considering the fact that AQMD is in such severe non-attainment with respect to NOx, I would respectfully request that AQMD take a support position on this particular regulation with ARB and both write a letter of support and also appear in Oakland on December 5th, which is a Thursday, to speak in favor of this regulation. It's rare that we have an opportunity to reduce emissions from ocean-going vessels because of the international jurisdictional issue, and this is really an opportunity not just for purposes of NOx reduction, but also in terms of health. Because according to ARB's calculations, which were approved by the Department of Finance over the summer, the proposed regulations will result in approximately 23 annual avoided cases of cardiopulmonary mortality, as well as lowering health costs statewide. Over time, the health benefits are proposed to be estimated to be worth $2.64 billion with a B in the form of localized reductions in cancer and decreased incidences of cardiopulmonary hospitalizations and emergency room visits. So with that said, I think it's important to take advantage of this opportunity to reduce those emissions directly from ocean-going vessels that are in ports all over the state. But as we know, the port of LA and Long Beach is the largest in the state and one of the largest in the country. And this is really an opportunity to step forward, both in terms of reducing emissions from those ocean-going vessels, as well as improving our health. So that's my statement, and I thank you for listening, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you. Carlos?
Thank you, Dr. Burke. Hello again. My name is Carlo Dela Cruz, and I am again speaking for the Sierra Club. I want to just say one comment about the plan that really relies heavily on additional incentive funding, either from federal or state sources. To be honest, this feels as much of a pipe dream as high-speed rail does in California, and I'm speaking as someone who voted in the affirmative for that bond in 2008. And all of us know that it's 2019, and we are still very, very far away from that. And I just say that as a word of caution because it's not often that I fully agree with Supervisor Rutherford and Mayor McCallan, but I do agree that if this measure was voted on today, it would not pass because I do not think the overall public understands just the context that we're in terms of our air quality crisis, but also how restricted this agency is when it does come to federal and international sources, as we heard. So I really want to suggest that instead of betting on 15 tons per day through $1.4 billion of incentive funding a year, we really, this agency respectfully needs to demonstrate that you're doing all you can do under your regulatory authority in order to clean up our air, in order to really build the public support that this agency has done everything it can do, and now it needs the public to help out with a potential tax increase in the future. And so I want to respectfully ask that staff really start considering sector-wide rules on certain stationary sources, including what's already become our largest source of emissions after already larger than power plants, and that's our built environment. That's the buildings that still use burning gas to heat and cook our food. There are alternative technologies that do not produce NOx and do not produce the greenhouse emissions that we're seeing across the basin. So I think there's a lot of good work here, and we see that it's really difficult to find ways of emission reductions with that that don't go beyond this agency's regulatory authority. But I think this is one sector, especially with stationary sources, that there's a lot of potential. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Do we need no motion required? So we are, items 4 and 5 are just reception of written reports, right?
That's correct, Dr. Burke.
Okay. How about, is there any other business before the Mobile Source Committee?
Any public comment?
None here.
None here.
None. Okay, then, and there's any public comment at any location?
No.
No.
None here? Okay. There is none, then we will adjourn this meeting until the next meeting, which will be Friday, November 15th, 2019 at 9 a.m.